Along with the Big Five personality test, IQ is one of the best and most commonly used psychometric instruments that we have. But it's not perfect, it has its limitations, and I've noticed people are fascinated with IQ, but also really don't seem to understand generally what it is, what it does, how it works, what the principles behind it are, what its limitations are. And so as someone who is reasonably familiar with the psychometric literature behind it, and also who breaks IQ tests in three different ways, I wanted to talk about this, give an overview of what IQ is, what it can do, as well as what it can't do. And before I do that, I want to address, I've noticed there are really four camps of people I see discussing IQ. One are people who are actually familiar with the psychometric literature and have some idea of what it is and what it's for. And they may make some of these mistakes too, but they generally have an understanding. IQ is a good rough proxy for what we understand as intelligence in most people within a given group. And then it's also useful, in a way it's often used, is discrepancies between subtests can help diagnose a number of psychiatric conditions. However, most people don't have that level of knowledge, and by far the most common thing I see is most people are like, oh yeah, I totally know IQ isn't intelligence, but also, what's your IQ, right? And then you have the people who are slightly more informed, and they divide into two mutually opposing camps, which are both equally stupid, frankly. On the one hand, you have the people who claim that because IQ tests, especially the most commonly used ones, are heavily culturally bound and cannot apply between groups, that means that there is no validity to IQ as a proxy for intelligence within groups, which is patently untrue, and feeds into the other group, who also feeds back into this group. Because then the other group sort of says, oh, IQ is everything. It's a perfect representation of intelligence, and intelligence should predict life success, which I've spent a lot of my life trying to downplay how smart I am, because my life success has been unimpressive, nowhere near what people think my intelligence should be, or what my IQ scores kind of suggest. As I said, I break the scores in three ways. Because of this idea that intelligence should reflect life success. And they also tend to insist that, okay, if it applies within groups, for the most part, it should apply between groups. And again, it's a proxy in very limited circumstances. And so these last two groups, they feed on each other. Both of these arguments are, frankly, really dumb, even though I've seen some really smart people advocating both. And I will acknowledge Mentis Wave, who I've talked about a bit. He has made me rethink some of how I think about intelligence, but he is in this second camp, and I think he's problematically wrong about this. But anyways, so IQ tests, basically the principle, they were developed by, I think, Alfred Binet, to try to find people who were developmentally delayed and catch them up, basically. And then they've sort of become a proxy for intelligence in general, because again, they apply within groups. And for most people, there are a remarkable number of things which correlate together with what is called the G factor. And so, like how many capital cities of the states you can name, and how good you are at math problems, and how quickly you can rotate a block in your head, and how quickly you can do data entry, and how many numbers you can remember and recite backwards, all of those things correlate pretty well with people who are relatively normal. But if you're not relatively normal, things get weird. And then again, the other thing is, IQ tests are culturally bound. So for example, the WAIS, which is seemingly the most commonly used one, that one has been administered to me several times. That one has 4 subcategories that it uses, and each contribute, I think, 25% to your score, which are, so they're the verbal stuff, they're the perceptual reasoning, so the spatial stuff, and then there's the working memory stuff, and then there is the processing speed tasks. And so with the WAIS, they have this question, they show you 4 maps, and they say, what's the city associated with Carl Sandburg? And the way that I know I've had this test administered at least 3 times is the first time I had it when I was in high school. I was like, well, I don't know, but I looked at the cities, and I think my logic was sort of, okay, well, 2 of these cities are New York and Los Angeles, as I recall, and so it's probably have to be a less prominent city. And then of the 2, I just picked Chicago, and I turned out to be right. So maybe I knew somewhere that he was associated with Chicago stories. But that is not only cultural knowledge, but cultural knowledge that most people who are not like my parents' generation won't even have anymore. But I happened to get it right and then look it up in next 2 times. And so a lot of these tests, there are supposedly culturally neutral tests like the Raven's matrices. And those are actually, because I've done, so in autism research, they often like to control for IQ, and it's common to do that. And I did some autism research in undergrad. And so that's what I use to control for IQ, because those are relatively culturally neutral. But they're not perfectly culturally neutral because they still assume you're looking for patterns that you learn about in Western countries. And so, for example, if you grew up like in a rural tribe in Africa, you are not going to be looking for these same patterns of shapes as someone who grew up, in an educated family in Massachusetts like I did, right? And so this is why everything, even the most culturally neutral IQ tests, are still, they only really represent relative intelligence within groups. And again, it's a proxy, it's not perfect. And so anyways, so with that in mind, as I mentioned, there's 4 subtests of the WAIS, which is the most common. And first way I break them is you are not supposed to give a score if you have more than a 1.5 standard deviation gap between your highest and lowest of these 4 groups of subtests. And I knew, because, so I had a bunch of these administered, a bunch of IQ tests when I was a kid. And then when I was in high school, I was taking high school psychology. And then I went back to the high school psychologist because I was like, hey, I just learned about IQ tests, and that thing you gave me 6 months ago seems like an IQ test. What's my IQ? And she said, well, I can't give you an IQ because your processing speed is so different from your other scores that I can't calculate. And she gave me a range, which I will get to. And I will say, modern, like the WAS tests, they will say processing speed and working memory are less likely to necessarily correlate than the verbal and the PRI. And so you can combine the verbal and PRI and give a GAI. She did not do that. My ADHD evaluation did, but there are other issues with that I will get to when I talk about the third issue, the third way I break IQ tests. But anyways, and then I got evaluated because when I turned 18, they believed that you could grow out of autism. And so I had to get re-diagnosed with autism at 18. And the guy who did that talked about, apparently, they did this like a half dozen times. They tried to give me IQ tests when I was like a minor, a half dozen times at least. And every single time, they concluded the gaps were too big between my highest and lowest score. And again, a gap of 1.5 standard deviations makes the test invalid. My processing speed is around the 2nd percentile, so it's around 70, which is, if it was standard, like just, you're using that for my IQ, I would be clinically retarded, which, I mean, also need to have life impairments, but processing speed does impair me in life. Like one example is when I got laid off, former coworker was like, hey, I really liked working with you. My company's looking to hire people. Did an interview with her person. And then she said, this is what we're looking for. And I'm like, well, I don't have that. And she's like, okay, but we're trying to do this. And so I guess you aren't good. And I'm like, it's like, wait a second. No, I can do what she's saying. I've done what she's saying. But then she was already, okay, thanks, we'll keep your resume on file, before I could say, wait, no, I've actually done that, right? And so that cost me a potential job opportunity. So slow processing speed does have life impairment consequences in that, and probably plenty of other situations as well. That's a memorable recent one. And so that is, again, my processing speed is generally below the 2nd percentile. And so, again, equivalent to, it's inverse Mensa, clinically retarded for processing speed. And then my working memory, which is my next lowest score, is generally around 110 to 115. In my ADHD evaluation, it was 112, or equivalent to an IQ of 112, which is, nice, comfortable midwit territory, which is still well over 2, almost 3 standard deviations above processing speed, which both processing speed and working memory are the performance aspects of IQ, or called the performance aspects. And I think they have other terms too, but that's the common one that you see in these tests. And they'll talk about the verbal performance gap. They'll often group math with verbal, because as I talked about, math is a language, and math and verbal tend to correlate in most cases, except with some exceptions like NVLD. And then my PRI and my verbal scores tend to be around or above 3 standard deviations above average. But that gets to the next 2 issues, the other 2 ways that I break IQ tests. And as I mentioned in a previous video, all of these are pretty well documented in the psychometric literature, which is that in ideal circumstances, I can generally cap these out on whatever it is. And so I've had plenty of tests that are considered to correlate with IQ or with what they would call the general ability index, which, so it's interesting because they will say you can give a general ability index if you have above average verbal and PRI and drop the working memory and processing speed if it's too low, but you can't do the inverse. And so, like, I do well on these, and when I've had tests that don't have performance, I've had a number where I've done well above 3 standard deviation above average, so that would equate to an IQ of 145. But there's 2 related issues. So one of them is what's called the ceiling effect, which is that, especially with the verbal, under ideal conditions, I'm likely to cap it out. And so you don't actually know, if you want to put a number on and say, well, how smart are you? What's your IQ? Well, I don't know, because the tests that I've taken, even under ideal circumstances, don't really go far above 3S, don't really go far above 145. They typically cap out around 150, 160. But then the other thing is you could say, well, at least you're definitely above 3SD reliably on the GAI, right? Well, no, because that's the third thing, which is, and I've talked about in my video on the Big Five, it is a bigger indictment of a test, failure of a psychometric instrument, if it fails in reliability versus validity. So validity is, does it measure what it says it does, or does it predict what it says it's going to do? Reliability is, are you going to get the same score under what the testers would think of as basically the same conditions? And I do not get the same score under basically the same conditions, because there are at least 2 factors I know of that can result in me missing points on tests where I'm already ceiling capped. And those are attention, which of course is an ADHD thing. And so, like with the GRE, which is considered to correlate with GAI, I got a perfect score on the verbal. I got 1 point off on the math, but all of the math questions are like basically just, did you remember high school math? And I just happen to remember basically all of my high school math, right? And so I wonder, the GRE was long when I was doing it because they had the writing section, and then they also unpaid test section. You didn't know what it was, so you had to do it. And I was exhausted. The last section I had was the math section. So, I wonder, good chance I just misread the question from inattention, right? And then the other thing is autistic, like overthinking and or misinterpretation. And so generally with the verbal, I'm getting noticeably above 3SD, at least I'm getting close to the ceiling. But when I did my ADHD evaluation, I only got a 145 on the verbal. And that one, the last question on the verbal, I remember, they were asking, what are the similarities between a picket fence and an anchor? And the answer to that, because I looked it up and I came up with it, my first thought was, oh, well, they keep things in place. Then I'm like, well, no, she said picket fence. Picket fences are mostly a symbolic decorative thing. And then I tried to think of answers, and then I couldn't. And this is where processing speed comes in again, because then I thought of a couple of possible symbolic answers, but I don't know if she would have accepted, but she'd already closed and moved on. And then I was like, it was bugging me. I'm like, okay, well, I thought of at least 3 answers, went home, looked at it, and I'm like, oh, it's the one that I dismissed because I thought picket had relevance. But no, just it's a fence and an anchor, and they keep things in place. And so, presumably, because I've had, again, even like by GAI, I don't always get a score that's above 3SD above, or even like close to the ceiling, which again is usually capped at like 150, 160-ish. And that's like a preoccupation. So both of these things, ceiling effect and the fact that people who tend to get high IQ or GAI scores tend to also have other things which make their results a lot less reliable, has been a preoccupation of like high IQ societies and such, is can we make tests that will have a high enough ceiling that you can account for, like, will they meet our cutoff even under like non-optimal conditions? But basically, to the extent that it's reflecting how smart I am, it's sort of reflecting I get a lot stupider under slight amounts of stress, right? And so in that sense, it might actually be valid that my GAI score can jump around. It doesn't jump around like a lot, but it can still jump around like enough to be a like close to a 1.5 standard deviations potentially in some cases, which is, again, depending on the ceiling and depending on other factors that are either inattention to the question or autistic overthinking about what the question means. Oh, and also, so going back to the first point, I was talking about, so I have generally at least a 5-point standard deviation between the lowest score, which is my processing speed, and then my highest score, which is the verbal stuff is generally at least at 3SD above average. So processing speed is generally at most 2SD below average, and sometimes it's a little bit lower. And then my verbal is generally at least 3SD above average. And even under suboptimal conditions, like even with the ADHD evaluation, I still got 3SD. Under less optimal conditions, my PRI can fall down to generally not to 2SD, but still closer to 2SD, right? But I actually have, so I sort of basing my understanding of my own IQ results on conversation with this high school psychologist, tests that I've taken that have a good correlation with GAI, and the 3 evaluations that I have. So my first autism evaluation that I was diagnosed, my autism evaluation getting re-diagnosed because they thought you could grow out of it at 18, where he is reporting on a lot of stuff, including that, again, apparently like half a dozen times they tried to give me IQ tests and the gap was too wide. And then my ADHD evaluation. And so actually, on my original diagnosis, the test they used had a scale that adult scales don't have, which is comprehension or social comprehension. And that one, I got below the first percentile. So that one was like a 6 standard deviation gap. And he said, you can't give a valid score on that one because, and that's also, the comprehension is within the verbal section. So even within the verbal metrics, I varied from below the first percentile on social comprehension on pragmatics to above the 99th on one of the, I forget which one it was. I could check, but I already forgetting what it was. But anyways, and that's, I studied pragmatics in undergrad because I had an interest in this as an autistic person, right? It's not obvious. Pragmatics is the social aspects, the social elements of how we use language. Oh, and actually, one more thing that I wanted to mention is, so people tend to assume that intelligence, or at least like IQ, is basically you have everyone that everyone at a lower intelligence has, and I really don't have that. Like I've talked about my thinking being upside down and outside in compared to most people, and that is like because things that people think should be hard are easy, and things that people think should be easy are hard. I was doing, like, as an elementary school kid, I was figuring out mathematical concepts that people get taught in college, and like they taught me long division, learned it in a couple examples, taught me algebra, learned it in a couple examples, wondered why are they keep hammering on this? It's so obvious. And these are both elementary school. Long division was 2nd grade, algebra was 4th grade, which I know that's not normal. My school was experimenting with this, and I think they dropped it because most of the students struggled with it, but that was fine. But the times tables, I remembered easily the numbers that had patterns. So, certainly the 2s, the 5s, the 9s were easy. But then the ones that didn't have patterns, I was the slowest student in the class to learn it. And that is actually reflected in a quote. So we have here from the guy re-diagnosing me with autism. So at the time, his broad math score was noted to reflect that although his overall mathematics standard score is within the superior range when compared to others in his grade, his performance varied on 2 different types of math tasks. His performance is very advanced on tasks requiring the ability to analyze and solve applied mathematical problems. His performance is limited to average on tasks requiring speed and accuracy when performing basic arithmetic operations. And so it is like, yeah, I cannot do things that people think are basic while being able to do things that seem advanced just because I approach things upside down and outside in. And what I've realized, and this is one of the reasons that I take Mentis Wave seriously, is he has made some observations about people who are above 3SD in IQ. And I've realized, well, first of all, one of them is you tend to be a broad autodidact above that level, which I am, which means you learn a lot about a lot of topics to a level. Like something I've noticed now is I am at the point where in a number of fields, if I'm talking to PhDs in that field, for most of them, on areas of their field outside their specialty, I know more about them, about the overall field than they do. I mean, it's not most fields, it's some fields this is the case, right? But it's like it's more than 2 or 3. It's also, to be clear, it's, again, most academics, they're highly specialized, they know a lot about the specialty, and it's not nearly all, it's most. So there are definitely plenty of people in fields, I've noticed this, who still know more about me than their field. It's just, it sort of shows I learned a lot about a lot. But the other thing I've noticed is it seems like, in general, at least for men, this upside down and outside in thinking seems to approximate with 3 standard deviations above average intelligence. It's different for women, because women I've talked to who I've asked, they'll often say, no, I was pretty normal. I only got like 1.5 to 2.5. And some of that is almost certainly the combination of ceiling effect combined with, if they're ADHD or autistic, they're going to have low working memory or low processing speed. But some of it is I wonder if IQ tests don't really represent women. One of the things you learn is women tend to have a more condensed profile. People like to say you have more male idiots and more male geniuses, but like I have not noticed. Like I feel like I meet as many women who I feel like are on my level as men, and certainly about as many women who I think in the upside down and outside in way. And so I'm wondering, like my qualitative approximation doesn't seem to reflect women's scores as well. But anyways, this form of thinking also has a tendency to sort of kneecap and trip. And so Arthur Koestler, The Act of Creation, which is the book I want to talk about more, he talks about this idea of biassociation. And I am really good at biassociation to the point that the pruning of things is the difficulty. And I think that is part of why my processing speed is so low. And that actually is another interesting quote from this evaluation when I was 18, where he says, on the projective tests, he went on in providing responses. The typical number of responses expected from the same-aged adolescents ranged from 15 to 20 for the 10 cards. He gave upwards of 180 responses. He had themes on themes. His associations were internally driven. He couldn't stop giving responses. I would finally indicate that we had enough data. His thoughts were not gated, and there was a true free associational quality to his responses, which, I mean, if you talk to me, or, I mean, you've seen my videos, right? But if you see me in interviews especially, or live streams, I can go on and on. And part of it is I just connect a lot of things, and my problem has always been reining it in, like paring it down for the average person. That's why I like talking to people who think like me, as they generally enjoy this kind of conversation. But it also, like, it does seem to come with the trade-off of impaired processing speed. And my working memory, I mean, it's like above average, like comfortable midwit range, but not particularly impressive, which shows that it's not necessarily the case that intelligence is like a linear thing that you have, you build on. And it is the case that the ability to solve more advanced, more abstract problems can come with impairments in day-to-day functioning. So, as I think I've said, like, I feel like the best IQ to be is probably, or assuming it correlates to intelligence, is probably a little bit above the average midwit, because the midwits they tend to have good, well-paying job, but also a lot of insecurity about their jobs. Their bosses and the people with job security tend to be, I think, a little bit above average, so maybe 1.5 standard deviations above average, which would be about an IQ of 123, which, fun fact, even though you're not supposed to calculate a full-scale IQ, the ADHD evaluation did. And so with the slightly impaired from long drive, which was another factor I didn't mention, was hour drive in traffic, which was probably impairing my response a little bit. And I wasn't on my ADHD meds, and I usually take my meds when I'm going to drive anywhere. But of course, for the ADHD evaluation, I couldn't. So that's especially stressful. Combined with the autistic overthinking on that last question, and the second percentile in processing speed, I got a score of 123, which actually is very close to the full-scale IQ score that Richard Feynman got and loved to brag about of 125. And that is, like, I think if that's actually your intelligence, and it's not like averaging a bunch of unpredictable factors, and you're actually like at about that level with everything, I think that's like the perfect level of intelligence that you actually want to be, or that's what I would predict. Oh, also, so the book club, Max Weber, Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism, that is Saturday the 29th at 2 p.m. Central. And I have the link in the description to the Discord server, which is currently locked down. I will unlock it. I'm going to figure out how to lock it and unlock it for the book club discussion. Then I also have a paid Discord for Ko-Fi supporters. That is just general discussion that is always open if you're a supporter. So anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one.